So next, we've got two amazing people coming out here. If you're in Austin, you probably know who Hurley is. He's a huge advocate of open source. He's been speaking all around the world on OpenGov, and he's going to do an interview with Representative Darrell Issa, who's been pushing OpenGov on Capitol Hill. It is an unbelievable pleasure to invite these people and to welcome them onto the stage here at GoodxGlobal, and I believe they're right behind me.
Thank you. How's everybody doing today? Really, you guys don't sound excited to hear this. This is open government. This is exciting stuff. Come on. That's better. All right. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce Congressman Issa, who is not here today in his role as a U.S. Congressman, but rather in his role as the founder of the Open Government Foundation, which is something I've been watching personally closely. My company, Chaotic Moon, participates in a lot of open efforts, and we've been traveling around the world, looking at other open government opportunities. I recently spoke in Amsterdam and some other areas, and it's really interesting to see what's going on in open government, why it's important, everything from protest to politics, and how this is going to really change kind of society as a whole. So with that, let me start by asking you a question that's pretty broad, which is, how would you define open government for everyone here?
Well, maybe the best way to explain it is this. In California, my home state, we have a law called the Brown Act. It specifically is designed so that 2 members of a 5-member city council don't go and make a deal, or 3 members, and then show up and you find out what the city council's doing that they already decided before they got there. The law doesn't work, but it's on the books. Well, that's what happens every day in Congresses, in state assemblies, in parliaments. Our goal in open government is to say that as much of the process as possible needs to be open, transparent, and accessible well in advance. And people talk about protest, but no one ever protested that which they didn't know was going to happen. You protest that in which you have information on. So Open Government Foundation was founded actually as a result of the SOPA and PIPA fight that became so broad on the internet, because we wanted to make sure laws were online, proposed laws were online, and the goal of the foundation at the federal, the state, the local level, and the international level, we already have an operation in New Zealand, is in fact to create the ability for the public to see that which is proposed and to directly participate in amending it in advance.
So tell me a little bit more about that. Tell me about SOPA and PIPA and how, you said this kind of came out of that. Why?
One of the things that happened and I'll just use the House name, SOPA, was that Stop Online Piracy was supposed to be about, quote, stopping online piracy, but ultimately inside the legislation, not seen by people or understood easily by people, was the ability to have denial of service, the taking down of sites. Essentially, we were losing our rights on the internet, and by the way, you could find yourself with the Attorney General's FBI going after you in secrecy. When we looked at that law, we said we've got to change the direction. We put that online. We put it out in something we called Madison, which is still up and running, where you could see the bill and you could actually go in and amend it, and people would recognize what you were saying and could comment on it or could further amendment. That's the essence of open government, is we strip back the data that people are trying to keep you from knowing, and then you and everyone else who can understand the legislation can have an open dialogue.
Now, that is a very interesting thing. With the large open source background that I have, there's always a price of participation. So you can put a lot of things out there, you can make them very open. Still, sometimes it's hard to get people to do it. With legislation, which is written in somewhat obscure language in a lot of cases, what does open government do to help people understand that, to get more people involved and basically take this complex language and kind of maybe translate it? How do you see that role in really expanding this effort?
Well, as we're developing the platform, what the goal is to create both the narrative so that people who want to say what they believe it means can say it, and the actual amendments. But what we also do is, like a social network, if you're participating, you have an identity. If I want to participate or I want to be involved and I like what I've seen you say or I don't like it, I now have the ability to interface with you. So on a particular issue where you either agree or disagree, you can build very quickly a network of people involved in it. Obviously, we'd like to take it to the largest possible level, but in some cases, there'll be interest. In some cases, there won't. That's democracy. But as long as there's access, if 2 people are arguing over an issue and it's important to them, and 2 million people are arguing over another issue and it's important to them, we have to be able to scale both of those discussions. And we think we can. But even more than that, open government is also about the tremendous amount of data that exists that in fact is not in a searchable format to the rest of us. You know, imagine that Siri, which goes out into lots of databases and tells you where a restaurant is, what if it was available for everything the government is doing and spending, and you wanted to find out anything about the waste or the opportunities in government? It would take the ability to crawl out and do that. Today, government is stovepipe so that nobody without special access and a lot of investment can actually find out all the spending in government. The president will say there's so many programs that are redundant, and then he finds out after his State of the Union speech, he missed a few. That's how complex it is.
Yeah, it seems like a very complex topic. Well, one of the things we want to do is be open here. So we want to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please let me know. I will translate it if we can't hear you. Who wants to ask the first question? No one ever wants to be the first. I think it's
I
you.
see a first right there.
That guy right there.
You could be swamped by all sorts of people with varying levels of expertise, trying to comment on, improve. And I've worked in large organizations that tried to do this within a company, and it gets bogged down. So how are you going to handle that on a national scale?
So that's a good question. I mean, I think about it from open source projects I've done, where you take something like the Apache web server that Brian Behlendorf and the guys did, and it's millions and millions of people that use it. It's hundreds of thousands of people that want to participate in the process, but there's a high signal to noise ratio in that. You know, how do you handle that?
This is one of the challenges in writing the code, was to create the ability, like Wikipedia, to have both authentication of people participating and an editing system that would not be exclusively congressional staff or members of Congress. And that's part of what's being developed. And one of the things that's exciting for Open Gov Foundation is the Knight Foundation is participating, and we're actually taking both the city of Annapolis and the state of Maryland and bringing them up online. And one of the reasons is that we believe we can do an entire state and a city and prove the scalability easier than going back into the federal government, particularly because we're getting cooperation on database access. And so that's part of what we're doing, is figuring out the scalability. But remember, the important point is, if you will, like a Wikipedia, it's about making sure that you do it. We're going to look at it. We're going to make decisions based on the input, but it's not about talking to your congressman. It's about talking to all of you who are for or against that, and then we evaluate that forum, which we think is a healthier dialogue than a lobbyist coming in and closing the door and telling us why we should vote for or against something, and you don't even know that occurred.
All right, who's got the next question? There's a gentleman right over here. Can we take the mic down? Oh, you got one there. You'll be next. Hang on. Sorry, he's already got one.
Hi, Representative. What is the biggest barriers right now, either politically or technologically?
Where's the biggest what?
The biggest barriers, either technologically or politically right now at a federal level for the Open Gov movement?
Great question. In short, the fact that the data is not transparent. Last Congress, the House voted out something called the Data Act that would have mandated that we have strong enough metadata, things like XBRL, so that these databases would be inherently searchable and operable. The SEC and a few other entities, the FDIC, have done it, but government-wide, they're still stovepipe with a bunch of other standards of choosing in some cases, they're all Oracle databases, but they're not interoperable. So that's the biggest challenge. And the amazing thing is, Congress has to mandate it because administration after administration has said they're going to do it, but it never gets done. That's probably our biggest challenge, and it should be the part that the American people are most insistent on, is something that will give them access over here.
It sounds like a great idea, but money seems to drive Congress, and deals behind the doors with lobbyists, et cetera, seems to be, that's life in Congress. So what sort of reaction are you really getting from your congressman to open this up and make it more apparent and more transparent?
The coalition we have is from the far left to the far right. It's not about ideology because people on the far left don't trust businesses' influence in government. Well, people on the far right don't trust government. So the two actually work out very well. Here's the biggest pushback we have. Universities, grant recipients, states, and cities who do not want to have their data reported up as to how they spent it. In other words, the people who get your tax dollars are pushing back pretty solidly on it and calling it burdensome. So one of the challenges that OpenGov, and for that matter the Data Act, are having is to make sure that the structure is one in which we can show that it's easier to report into common databases, not harder. Doesn't change the fact that recipients kind of like the idea they get the money and then no one really knows how they spend it. So that will be a pushback, and it's actually a pushback from some of the organizations you most trust, but who really don't want the details of how they spend the money always known.
So it looks like we're out of time, but I want to ask you
No,
one
don't pay any
question.
attention to
Don't
the
pay
clock.
Yes, we're not. We're going to open.
How many want us to stay a little longer? There you go.
That's not enough people. Let me try this. How many people would like us to keep going for a little bit? Really? It was less people,
Yeah.
but they cheered.
Yeah.
So that counts. But I want to interject a question. What is the best way for people to help drive this process aside from just going online and making comments and stuff? How can people get active? Is the organization set up where people can volunteer in certain cities? You said you're rolling it out on the state level to avoid the complexity of the federal. How do
Well,
they
we're
get
rolling it out
engaged?
at both, but we've been funded to do specific software development at that level. Organizations need to demand this, whether it's the Sunlight Foundation or any other organization. You need to demand things like the Data Act. You need to tell your elected officials that they need to move your access because it's a structural change. That's the biggest point that we're trying to make. It's the reason the OpenGov Foundation exists, is to create a structural change for all the other organizations. And that's really what we want to look at. You can pick almost any organization you're involved in and use it as a lobby tool to say, we want that ability, whether it's to find out where there's grant money better, or it's to find out where grant money is being misspent, or it's simply to know what your government's about to do to you rather than for you.
So before we go off the stage or get pulled off, where can people go and learn more?
Well, obviously, OpenGov Foundation, you can search it and go to it as an entity. But again, we have almost every good government organization supporting the process. They support the Data Act, and they're supporting this. I often, because I'm a Republican, I often mention people like the Sunlight Foundation, thought of as a left organization. We are completely united on this, so you don't have to pick and choose.
Excellent.
Ultimately, I'm a congressman, even though I said I wasn't here in that capacity. To the extent that you can reach members of Congress to co-sponsor the Data Act, it passed out of the House, but it got tied up in the Senate. Anyone that can reach a senator and say this needs to move would make a huge difference in your having access to the data about how your government spends your money.
Well, Congressman Issa, thank you so much for coming out and telling us about this today.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.